Listen, I need to tell you about Alfred Packer, but not the way the history books describe him. Not as some desperate pioneer who made impossible choices to survive. Before I dive into this terrifying true crime case, I have to ask, what do you think really happened in those mountains? Please comment below because this disturbing mystery continues to haunt America, and people deserve to know the real truth behind these unexplained events. No, Alfred Packer was something else entirely. Something cursed from the moment he set foot in those godforsaken Colorado mountains in 1874. The man who entered the San Juan wilderness with 5 companions but came back alone, his belly full and his eyes holding secrets that would haunt America for generations. This isn't just a story about cannibalism. It's about supernatural horror that goes deeper than starvation. About a man who discovered that human flesh didn't just sustain his body but fed something dark and insatiable in his soul. When people hear the name Alfred Packer today, they think of textbooks and museum displays. Maybe some macabre joke about the cafeteria named after him at the University of Colorado. But they don't understand the paranormal phenomena that really happened in those mountains. Don't comprehend the evil that was born in the snow and ice of that terrible winter. Alfred Packer didn't just become a cannibal out of necessity, he became something far worse. And if you listen closely to the wind in the San Juan Mountains even now, more than a century later, you can still hear him chewing, still smell the smoke from his cooking fires, still feel the weight of his hungry gaze following you through the trees. This unsolved mystery has become one of America's most disturbing true crime cases, with paranormal investigators and ghost hunters still trying to understand the eerie phenomena that surrounds his legend. The locals know better than to speak his name out loud, know that some hungers never die, that some supernatural appetites only grow stronger with the passing years. The journey that would damn Alfred Packer's soul began in February 1874, when he convinced 5 men to follow him into the San Juan Mountains during the worst winter Colorado had seen in decades. Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan, their names should be remembered as victims in this terrifying true story. But history has nearly forgotten them in favor of focusing on the monster who devoured them. Packer told them he knew a route through the mountains to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, promised them safe passage through terrain that experienced guides wouldn't attempt in the best of weather. The mountains in winter were a landscape from hell itself. Endless expanses of snow that swallowed sound and hope alike, temperatures that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs, and a silence so complete it felt like the world had died around them. But it wasn't just the cold and desolation that made those peaks feel cursed. There was something else watching from the shadows between the trees. Something supernatural that had been waiting for the right kind of man to feed its ancient hunger. From the moment they entered that wilderness, Alfred Packer changed, became something predatory and patient, his eyes taking on a gleam that had nothing to do with snowblindness and everything to do with dark appetites that civilized men aren't supposed to acknowledge. His companions noticed it too, the way he would stare at them when he thought they weren't looking, the way he seemed to be measuring them like a butcher evaluating livestock. This chilling behavior would later become key evidence in what paranormal researchers call one of America's most disturbing unexplained phenomena. The mountain's silence pressed down on them like a living thing, broken only by the crunch of their boots through snow and the increasingly labored breathing of men pushed beyond their limits. Food ran out faster than Packer had promised, and that's when the real horror began. When civilized men started looking at each other with eyes that belonged in slaughterhouses rather than around campfires. This terrifying transformation marks the beginning of what true crime investigators consider one of the most disturbing cases of survival cannibalism in American history. Packer rationed their supplies with mathematical precision, but somehow he never seemed as hungry as the others, never showed the same desperate weakness that was consuming his companions day by day. Shannon Bell was the first to voice what they were all thinking, that Packer's pack seemed heavier than it should be, that he disappeared into the woods too often and for too long, that sometimes in the middle of the night they could hear him chewing something that didn't sound like jerky or hardtack. The others began whispering among themselves when Packer wandered off to scout their route, sharing suspicions that grew more paranoid and more justified with each passing day. These eerie encounters would later become the foundation for ghost stories that still terrify Colorado residents today. Frank Miller swore he'd seen Packer sharpening his knife while staring at Israel Swan's throat, and George Noon claimed he'd caught their guide examining James Humphrey's arms and legs with the calculating gaze of a man planning a meal. But when they confronted him about it, Packer just smiled that cold smile and reminded them that he was their only hope of getting out of those mountains alive. An assurance that sounded more like a threat with each repetition. The snow kept falling, the cold kept biting, and one by one, Packer's companions started disappearing into the white silence that surrounded them like a tomb. They died in order of their usefulness to Alfred Packer, though he would later claim it was self-defense, that each man had attacked him in a fit of starvation-induced madness. and that he'd had no choice but to kill them to protect himself. But the evidence told a different story. Spoke of deliberate murder carried out with the patience of a hunter who enjoyed the process as much as the result. Shannon Bell went first, found in his bedroll one morning with his skull caved in by Packer's hatchet, the wound too clean and precise to have been struck in panic or desperation. Then James Humphrey vanished during a blizzard, his body discovered days later with systematic cuts that suggested someone had been practicing butchery techniques on living flesh. Frank Miller lasted longer, maybe because he was the strongest of the group, but even he couldn't survive the methodical stalking that Packer had perfected during their weeks in the wilderness. George Noon and Israel Swan died together, their throats cut while they slept, positioned around the campfire like they were still warming themselves by flames that had long since died out. Each killing was more elaborate than the last, more deliberate in its cruelty, as if Packer was learning to savor not just the meat but the murder itself. And through it all, he kept detailed mental notes of which cuts produced the best flavor, which organs provided the most nutrition, which bones cracked most satisfyingly when split open for their marrow. What happened next in those mountains goes beyond mere cannibalism into territories that human language isn't equipped to describe adequately. Alfred Packer didn't just eat his companions out of desperation. He cooked them with the care of a chef preparing a feast. Seasoned their flesh with wild herbs he foraged from beneath the snow, arranged their bones around his campfire like some primitive altar to hunger itself. The smell of roasting human meat mixed with pine smoke and mountain air, creating an aroma that seemed to attract things from the deeper wilderness, shadows that circled his camp but never came close enough to be seen clearly. Packer claimed later that he felt sick with every bite, that consuming human flesh was the most terrible experience of his life, and that he only did it to survive long enough to return to civilization. But survivors who encountered him months later told a different story. They described a man who licked his fingers clean after every meal, who spoke lovingly about the texture and taste of human muscle, who seemed to have developed a genuine appreciation for flavors that should have disgusted any decent person. He kept journals during those winter months, pages filled with detailed descriptions of his culinary experiments and philosophical observations about the superiority of human meat over conventional livestock. The hunger that had started as a survival necessity had transformed into something far darker, an appetite that grew stronger with each feeding and left him craving not just flesh but the act of taking it from living bodies. Discovery came in spring when other travelers found Packer's campsite, now revealed by melting snow to be an abattoir that stretched across several acres of mountain meadow. Bones lay scattered around multiple fire rings, some split open with surgical precision to extract every trace of marrow, others bearing cut marks that suggested the meat had been removed while the victims were still alive. Skulls were cracked open like eggs, brain matter scraped clean from the inside and arranged in neat rows that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Personal effects from the 5 missing men were found buried in shallow graves, but their bodies, what remained of their bodies, told a story of systematic consumption that went far beyond survival cannibalism into ritualistic territory. Investigators found evidence that Packer had been smoking and curing human meat for long-term storage, had built elaborate racks for drying strips of flesh, had even constructed primitive refrigeration systems using snow and ice to preserve his food supply. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of carefully preserved organs, hearts and livers and kidneys stored in makeshift containers and arranged according to some internal logic that only made sense to the man who had created this mountain charnel house. When they finally tracked down Alfred Packer 3 months later, living comfortably in civilization and showing no signs of the starvation he claimed had driven him to cannibalism, he still carried the smell of wood smoke and human fat in his clothes. The trial of Alfred Packer became a sensation across America, partly because of the gruesome nature of his crimes, but mostly because of his complete lack of remorse or shame about what he'd done in those mountains. He sat in the defendant's chair like a man recalling a pleasant vacation, describing in clinical detail how he'd prepared and consumed each of his victims while the jury grew pale and several spectators fainted or fled the courtroom in horror. His testimony was filled with contradictions that revealed more than they concealed, claiming self-defense while admitting he'd eaten parts of his companions that weren't necessary for survival, insisting he felt sick with every bite while describing with obvious relish the particular flavors and textures he'd discovered. Witnesses who'd encountered him after his emergence from the mountains testified that he'd seemed healthy and well-fed, even robust, showing none of the physical deterioration they'd expected from a man who'd endured months of starvation in the wilderness. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered his companions for food, but the defense insisted he was simply a man who'd made impossible choices to survive an impossible situation. What neither side acknowledged was the possibility that Alfred Packer had discovered something in those mountains that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with appetites that most people can't even imagine, much less understand. The courtroom itself seemed to absorb some of the evil that emanated from the defendant, with jurors reporting nightmares about being hunted and consumed. Witnesses developing sudden aversions to meat that lasted for months after the trial ended. The curse that Alfred Packer carried out of the San Juan Mountains didn't end with his conviction and imprisonment. It spread like a disease through the communities that had heard his story, infecting the nightmares and folklore of generations of Colorado families. Parents began using his name to frighten disobedient children, warning them that if they wandered too far into the woods or stayed out past dark, Packer would smell their young flesh and come hunting for them with his hatchet and his insatiable appetite. Local guides refused to lead expeditions through the areas where his crimes had taken place, claiming the land itself had been poisoned by what happened there, that animals avoided those valleys and streams, that even in summer the air carried the smell of wood smoke and rotting meat. Hunters reported finding bone fragments that looked suspiciously human, arranged in patterns around cold fire rings that shouldn't have existed in places where no one was supposed to have camped. Hikers spoke of feeling watched while traveling through certain mountain passes, of hearing the sound of someone chewing loudly in the distance, of catching glimpses of a tall figure moving through the trees with the purposeful gait of a predator stalking prey. The curse seemed to be strongest during winter months, when snow covered the mountains and created the same conditions that had turned Alfred Packer from a guide into a monster. Folklore about Alfred Packer grew and twisted over the decades, transforming him from a historical figure into something closer to a boogeyman. A cautionary tale that parents told their children to keep them safe and obedient. But unlike most childhood monsters, Packer had actually existed, had really committed the atrocities that formed the basis for the stories, had genuinely developed a taste for human flesh that he'd carried with him until his death in prison decades later. Colorado mountain communities developed traditions and superstitions specifically designed to ward off Packer's influence. Never camping alone in the high country, always carrying blessed salt to sprinkle around campsites, never cooking meat over an open fire in areas where he'd been known to hunt. Old-timers would point out specific peaks and valleys where they claimed his ghost still wandered, still searching for fresh victims to satisfy the hunger that death hadn't been able to extinguish. Children grew up hearing whispered stories about hikers who'd gone missing in Packer territory, whose bones were later found gnawed clean and arranged in patterns that matched the crime scenes from 1874. The most persistent legend claimed that Packer's ghost grew stronger during hard winters when conditions in the mountains matched those that had first awakened his cannibalistic appetites, and that anyone foolish enough to venture into his hunting grounds during a blizzard would smell wood smoke and cooking meat just before they felt his hatchet splitting their skull. I'm telling you this because I made the mistake of hiking through the San Juan Mountains last winter, following some of the same routes that Alfred Packer had taken with his victims more than a century ago. I thought the stories were just folklore, regional legends designed to add some gothic flavor to Colorado's frontier history. But 3 days into my solo backpacking trip, when the snow started falling and the temperature dropped below zero, I began to understand why those mountains had been able to transform a frontier guide into America's most notorious cannibal. The silence up there is absolute, so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the sound of your blood moving through your veins. But underneath that biological soundtrack, if you listen carefully, you can hear other things: the crunch of footsteps that don't match your own pace, the sound of someone breathing who isn't you, and worst of all, the unmistakable noise of teeth grinding against bone. On my second night, I caught the smell of cooking meat drifting through the pine trees, rich and savory and completely out of place in wilderness where no one else should have been camping. I followed the scent for nearly an hour, moving through snow that seemed to muffle my footsteps while amplifying the sound of whatever was moving parallel to my path, always just beyond the range of my flashlight. I never found the source of that smell, but when I returned to my own campsite, I discovered that someone had been through my gear, had examined my food supplies and my sleeping bag, had even rifled through my backpack looking for something I couldn't identify. The snow around my tent was marked with footprints that were too large and too deep to have been made by any animal native to those mountains. And the pattern they made suggested someone who'd been circling my camp for hours, studying me the way a predator studies prey before deciding whether to attack. I tried to convince myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone who'd gotten lost and was looking for help. But deep down, I knew better. There was something deliberate about those tracks, something patient and calculating, that reminded me of the stories I'd heard about Alfred Packer's hunting methods. The third night was when I saw him, or at least saw something that might have been him, moving between the trees about 50 yards from where I'd pitched my tent. It was tall and lean, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a different century, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that had learned to hunt in deep snow. I watched it circle my camp for what felt like hours, never coming close enough for me to see its face clearly, but never moving so far away that I lost sight of it completely. The worst part wasn't the stalking itself. It was the realization that whatever was out there was enjoying the process, was taking its time because it knew I had nowhere to go, no way to escape from mountains that had become a hunting ground for appetites that normal people can't comprehend. When morning came, the figure was gone, but the snow around my camp was littered with bone fragments that looked suspiciously human, gnawed clean and cracked open for marrow that had been extracted with surgical precision. I packed up and headed back to civilization as fast as my legs could carry me. But even now, months later, I still catch the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat when the wind blows from the direction of those mountains. I still hear the sound of someone chewing in the distance, still feel the weight of hungry eyes watching me from shadows that shouldn't exist in populated areas. Alfred Packer died in prison in 1907, but whatever drove him to cannibalism in those Colorado mountains, that's still up there, still waiting for the right kind of winter, the right kind of victim, the right conditions to feed again. Some hungers are deeper than death, some appetites only grow stronger with time, and some mountains hold on to their ghosts longer than civilized people are comfortable admitting. If you ever find yourself hiking through the San Juan Mountains in winter, if you catch the smell of cooking meat where no one else should be camping, if you hear the sound of footsteps following your trail through the snow, remember Alfred Packer, remember what happened to Shannon Bell and James Humphrey and Frank Miller and George Noon and Israel Swan, and remember that some legends are too hungry to stay buried in history books where they belong. If this chilling true crime story gave you goosebumps, if you want to hear more terrifying tales of unexplained phenomena and disturbing mysteries that authorities tried to cover up, please subscribe and share this video with others who need to know the truth about America's darkest secrets. Your support helps us investigate more paranormal cases like Alfred Packer's and bring awareness to the supernatural events that continue to haunt our nation. Don't let these stories be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and help us uncover more unsolved mysteries and ghost stories that demand to be told. Together we can expose the hidden horrors that lurk in America's past and present.